The most interesting part of Phantom Brigade is in how its combat functions. Yes, this is a turn-based tactical game, but the entire thing is based around a time manipulation mechanic. Basically, time freezes and you're able to see enemy movements and plan your own 5 seconds slow motion in advance. After you get that all set up, you press the execute button and watch the battle unfold. So if you've ever looked at a video editing timeline and thought, wow, that would be so cool if it let me control a war game, then you'll be pretty at home here. Brace Yourself Games of Crypt of the Necrodancer fame initially released the 1.0 version of this one back in 2023, February 28th to be exact. Now, 1.0, if I understand correctly, had virtually no story elements and was a much more open-world feel in general. I guess there was a simple cinematic giving a real basic world setup, and then you're dumped into a gameplay loop more akin to what I see users describe as Mount and Blade. That being a large overworld map for you to retake back from enemies at your leisure. This first version of the game has changed in a few big areas when a 2.0 saw the light of day November 19th of 2025. Notably, the overworld was replaced with a much more structured setup of liberating specific province areas incrementally before moving onward. Some areas are optional while others are mandatory as you make your way to the final face-off in the capital city. This also includes some more story text, but overall still feels pretty minimal. This 2.0 version is what I played. And who am I, you might ask? Hi, I'm Empty. I'm a bit of a mecha newbie that decided that I think giant robots are so cool that I want to play every single mech game ever made. And while I work my way through this mission, I took it upon myself to also make video reviews, game showcases, and general commentary on mech games here on this YouTube channel. If you'd like to keep up with me, we'd love to see you hit the subscription button, but if you do want to take your support a step further, I did start putting a few logos up on merch that'll be linked in the description below. My favorite is this design I created based on the original Japanese logo for Xbox's coolest mech game, Phantom Crash. Thanks. While the plot is pretty limited, there is still a bit to go off of. The game begins at the Boundary Falls outpost in the Furland Republic as a couple of pilot cadets exit out of their mech garages. These are pretty cool, and it only occurs to me after rewatching this, after playing the game all the way through, I don't think these garages actually exist in-game. I only remember enemies being airdropped into areas. Maybe that's because these enemies are invaders from outside the Furland. The Cascade Dominion invades for a nameless reason and seemingly takes over the region. I think this imagined world is loosely based around Scandinavia and or the Baltics. Anyways, the Cascade Dominion grants the Furlanders a swift and crushing defeat, though seeds of rebellion are sowed. The remnants of Furland loyalists stand together as a group called the Furland Freedom Forces, or 3F for short. The 3F sits in wait for 3 years until the most opportune moment to rise up and liberate their homeland. Despite their numbers being smaller than the Dominions, they do have a special card up their sleeve, that being a limited number of prototype prediction technology units. This presents a select few mech pilots with a massive upper hand, as this is a piece of tech that enables them to see things before they happen. Think of it like a mini 5-second time travel, if you will. This technological sixth sense, new type ability massively aids the 3F going forward. First, the group starts small, liberating local farming communities or forgotten mining settlements. The mobile base carries the so-called Phantom Brigade, with it not only just their mechs, but hope for the average citizens. Hope to see the Cascade overthrown from their ill-gotten thrones in the capital district. From this point, the plot is pretty limited. You'll move across a static world map. Each node is a different province area to liberate. These all do have a minor text blurb in regards to their lore, however once you make it into the area it's more so generated scenarios. There is a lack of things like villains and named enemy characters. Details of this story are mostly things you'll need to create in your own head. Like in the case of my first pilot group. While learning the game, I managed to cause my pilot to friendly fire on his own companion. The companion mech ended up getting fully down, thus permanently injuring the pilot with a trauma debuff. Bad back. At the same time, the friendly fire shooter himself got a temporary debuff as well, which I likened to the fact that he must have felt bad about shooting down his buddy. At a separate point in a different campaign, I had a pilot whose trauma debuff was about ripping some of the armor plating off of his mech. I guess I caused this guy to overheat too much in combat, and he was real upset about a lack of air conditioning in his mech. Of course, this goes into headcanon territory and isn't really a fully written story. I will say I think the gameplay depth leans into this with ease if you've got a little bit of imagination. Though be warned, this game does include permadeath, so if you're like me and have made these little stories for your pilots in your own head, you might be pretty bummed when they die off. Like my Interceptor pilot Zerk, that was carried from the very beginning of the first mission into nearly the capital district before suffering an untimely demise at the hands of tank missiles that I definitely should have been paying attention to. Okay, so there really isn't any sort of day-to-day or slice of life sort of thing in between combat to really enable the humanizing of these pilot characters. That would have really helped make the permadeath mechanic feel more impactful, I think. Without developing emotional attachment, at worst the permadeath feels more like FOMO, in which case it's more so the stress that comes from knowing my fully leveled pilot has to be replaced by a complete rookie, which will be hard to level as I get into the late game stages, and less so about heartbreak. Actually, some areas are a bit scripted. I think the first example of this is the Western Pass. This area is a requirement to move through to get into the further opened Furland. Think of it like a gate area, if you will. Here, there aren't procedural combat scenarios, it's just a specific boss fight. These happen on a few occasions. Pretty much all of these have you show down against a few behemoths. These are sort of like giant beetles, except in robot boss fight form, meaning they've got lots of big guns. At another point, I was in an area with a modifier that I was being hunted. Periodically, through battle scenarios, an elite mecha pilot would show face to aid the defense of the Cascade. It would have been really cool if more of this sort of thing would happen. Maybe make a villain like this named, have them make scripted appearances through a full run of the game. That would have probably really livened up the story. Anyways, when you do manage to make it to the capital district, the liberation concludes when your mobile base, modified with behemoth weapon parts, blasts the Dominion Citadel out of the horizon. The Furland cheers and the credits roll. You do get the option to continue playing after this. If you've left areas open to be liberated, you can return to them for cleanup. When it comes down to it, this game really doesn't have much story going for it and is really more of a mechanics game. So if you're someone who plays games for the story, this is not going to be it for you. First off, when you get into the gameplay, you'll be prompted to navigate a world map. This has a handful of province areas on it, like Headmark, the Western Pass, Breakfast, or the Capital District. Once you move into these areas, you get presented with a province map. In the province maps, you control the mobile base, which carries your crew around. While in the province map, you'll sometimes get random events with question marks to find. These are sometimes things like found supplies or traders. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. While you're here, you can also upgrade the mobile base and its workshop. print armors faster, have more room for pilots, and so on. The mobile base also functions as our garage for swapping out mech parts, leveling up pilots, camping to recover hit points, and so on. The overall goal here is to liberate this entire province. If you notice, the top left of the screen will see a liberation meter. Completing events against the Cascade Dominion will increase this liberation meter dependent on the difficulty of the combat scenario. The further along we get in the campaign, the more events need to be completed for liberation, more events that raise in difficulty and grant less liberation points. If we take too long to do this though, we end up losing liberation points as the Cascade end up regrouping. The balance in regards to this felt pretty decent for me, really. It felt like it incrementally raised the difficulty. On the other hand, some of the scenarios and maps really started to take their toll in terms of repetition. I kept seeing repeated maps, repeated scenarios, and so on. Increasing the number of event completions needed per area makes for a long play session if you get some bad rolls and repeat the same objectives. What I mean by that is that the enemy nodes within the map section disappear when they regroup over time and a new set is generated. When you move or camp, time moves onward, so we gotta think carefully about our moves. Basically, this ramps up. First we do raiding missions, then we move on to some bigger liberation missions, and then finally the end phase to complete the province area is a showdown against a boss. Boom! Province provided freedom, baby! Now the real meat and potatoes of this game is the combat sections themselves. There's a pretty decent variety of objectives, really. Sometimes it's pretty simple, like enemy patrol moving around the map, or an ambush on enemy supply lines, but other times it's a great boss fight or a slick assassination. I'll give you a quick rundown on a few of the ones I'd seen more frequently. Liberations mean you'll have to destroy the enemy units in a friendly settlement. You know, around people's houses. If you accidentally cause too much damage to the citizen housing here, you'll have to pull out and you lose the battle. If you take too long, you'll receive NPC-controlled reinforcement units. These guys sound like they'd be helpful, but they're big fans of artillery, and the artillery has a bad habit of cross-firing into civilian structure. Ouch. Demolitions are the opposite of liberations. Here you'll wander into enemy-created architecture with a game plan to destroy as much as possible before they can summon in enough reinforcements to run you out. Assassinations. My favorite setup is pretty straightforward. You'll drop into an area teeming with baddies with a targeted bullseye at a certain individual. Blast him down and then make your escape while the rest of the Cascade scramble. I loved equipping my team with all sorts of missiles and nuking the target into a crater in 2 turns. Convoy is the ambush of enemy supply lines. Usually this is to attack a supply line of tanks or something like that. However, there is one mission where you'll be placed on a massive moving train. This was a pretty cool mission. You have to run through the cargo, attacking the defensive measures and shutting down the generators that keep the train running. We gotta get it to stop so that we can take the cargo for our own war effort. Bunker Breach is a combat encounter that takes place inside an underground base instead of above land. These ones were kinda cool, like fighting through a parking garage. Since there's a roof, you can't really use aerial attacks like the artillery, and the tight corridors make things interesting. And there's several more even. One of them you do a sort of king of the hill over a crate. Anyways, I should probably stop yapping about this and try to explain how the combat actually functions, since that's probably what most people are actually here for. First thing, you set up your pilots and mechs. Pilots all have their own specific stats, but I'll talk about that in a second. In the actual encounters, you'll control up to 4 mechs. You control them via this timeline up to 5 seconds into the future. Movement, waiting, attacking, dodges, and so on all have to be lined up on this timeline before hitting the execute button. After that, you'll watch what you've set up play out. It's pretty easy to not pay attention and cause your mechs to friendly fire or crash into each other. Luckily, if you do pay attention, like you're supposed to, you can see everything that is supposed to happen within the time frame. Also, actions will all have a heat rating, meaning you'll wreck your mech if you try to do too much at once due to overheat. It might sound complicated, but it's actually pretty intuitive once you play it. That is until you get into the very last second of the projected future. You really can't see further ahead in the timeline than this, so it is possible to set actions that cause overheat into your next turn without really knowing or understanding that it'll happen. Also, sometimes you'll be able to set a run action several turns in advance, but sometimes it hiccups if it's just too close to that exact 5-second mark for some reason. Also, some things like missiles don't seem to track very well in this system at all. You'll launch them and then maybe watch them fly around the sky for a couple of turns before they actually manage to make it to hitting their target. My biggest gripe with the combat gameplay is that I don't feel it does a good enough job in terms of predictive damage. Many times I have set actions to either over or under fire against enemies running on a vibe in terms of damage taken instead of a more concrete number. I get that sometimes there are factors like missing the target entirely that are to account for, but sometimes I just felt a little lost on what damage per second my guys were actually doing. And speaking of the damage, of course different weapons do different types. Not only that, but the mechs themselves have different parts. Blowing off the arms removes the ability to hold weapons, leaving them only the option to shoulder into tanks, melee style. Blowing off the legs slows movement, and shooting out the chest makes the whole thing do a kablooey. Some weapons target the pilot specifically, which is its own health bar too. That is, if you can kill them before they manage to eject to safety. There's a whole kill the meat, save the metal thing going on here, which can be important considering after combat completions, you'll not only gain rewards, but have salvage to choose. Salvage items come in not only their own levels, but a color rating for rarity, RPG style. You'll only be able to carry a certain amount of salvage per encounter, so you'll have to figure out what you're taking whole, what you're salvaging into material resource, and what you're leaving behind entirely. You'll use resources to do things like upgrade your mobile base, trade for new pilot cadets, or maybe use the giant 3D printer in the back of the bus for a whole new chunk of mecha. With items taken whole or created, you'll have the option of setting the upper body, lower body, left and right arms, main weapon, side weapon, and back weapon. On top of that, pretty much all of these can have a few modifier parts to really min-max things into place. You know, things like extra venting systems, or targeting modules, or an extra padded pilot pod. Like I mentioned before, pilots all do have their own stats too, or maybe that's the wrong word. Traits? They all have their own traits, and classes. Take for example my Defender, who I lovingly named Tankus after a guy I remember pugging the Wailing Caverns with in World of Warcraft when I was 15. He was a non-tank spec warrior named Tankus who couldn't make it past the cliff jump. Anyways, Tankus the Defender, mech pilot, gets traits aimed at protecting. She's good with shields, heavy armor, and I definitely chose the perk Dummy Thick so that she'd have a larger health pool. There are a few other classes, engineers who do a bit of support, interceptors for getting close and personal, and of course sharpshooters for sniping. Pilot perks work on a prestige system. Once they level up, a selected perk will stay behind while others are lost, until they level up again. This is typically the way to go because at a certain point this stacks. But what also stacks? The mental strain of being a mech pilot. You got that right. This might be the only mech game utilizing mental trauma as a mechanic. We see this a lot in mech anime shows, but this is the only time I think I've seen it in a video game before, and it's a really neat inclusion. So you've got battle fatigue, which is the amount a pilot can actually fight before tiring out and needing rest, but then you've got trauma too. Pilots get this by getting downed in combat and can only take on so much trauma before they permadeath from your game forever. These traumas are nearly all flaws, like being brittle and suffering damage easier, or getting rattled from grenades to the point of suffering chronic concussive migraines that cause greater damage to themselves from the damage type. If this isn't complicated enough between the mechs, the mobile base, the map systems, the pilot's mood, the pilot's medical history, I'll also tell you that each encounter can have its own modifiers on top of everything else too. Like when the weather is raining, this functions as a heat dampening mechanic, which is super cool. If you want to make things even crazier, this game does have a Steam Workshop integration for user-created mods. A lot of these are minor gameplay tweaks, like allowing more trauma, rehabilitation, or changing pilot portraits to JPEGs of popular characters from other shows. The coolest one that I saw when I peeked in there was the dude who reskinned all of the armaments to make Phantom Brigade function as a reenactment of everyone's favorite one-year war. That's just super cool. It occurs to me while editing this, I totally forgot to include the remote operations contracts where you control friendly NPCs remotely, in which case it does not progress your main campaign story, but it does enable you to get additional armaments through doing these missions without your main crew of characters. The general graphics are alright, but I'm not sure if there is much to talk about in this regard. The environments are all passable, but I don't know if there was ever a moment where I thought something was especially visually striking or super memorable. As I've said before, this is really a gameplay-forward game more than anything else. I guess in the visual space, maybe I should say that its UI felt really good. Everything has its place and remains readable. I feel like user interface is one of those things where if you do it good, nobody ever really notices, but if you do it even slightly bad in any way, it becomes very obvious and obnoxious. And I gotta say, I didn't have any complaints about that. Everything's easily readable, the information is featured where it needs to be. On the mech side themselves, I think they do have a unique design as far as with comparison to other mech games. However, I'm not sure if I like it all that much personally, to be frank. I can't exactly pinpoint what it is about the mechs that comes across as, I guess, uninteresting to me. Maybe it's that their animations are too human-like. Maybe it's that the gameplay pulls the camera back far enough I never really focus on the intricate details of their armor plating. There's just something about them that reminds me a lot of those T13 articulated 3D printed figure toys. I think it's something about the proportioning and how exposed and simple all of the joints connect. Now don't get me wrong, I really do appreciate Phantom Brigade's effort to make its mechs look like their own thing, even if it isn't something that necessarily tickles my fancy. I will say in regards to mech visual customization, I did feel it was a bit lacking. Certain parts carry over stylistically between three weights, light, medium, and heavy, though they have more or less armor added. This is a cool idea, but I feel like overall it makes the certain pieces lack visual identity, especially when you're actually playing the battle scenarios and are at a bird's eye view. It's very hard to really tell the mechs apart from each other from this distance. As far as visual flair, there is the option to color and name them, however the colors are pre-selected in trios, meaning you don't really get to color things yourself that much, unfortunately. Pilot portraits are more customizable, on the other hand. You can change quite a bit here, even the camera angle or put overlays over them. Do your pilots like to wear hats, or maybe glasses, or helmets? Maybe that's the best choice, a pilot in a pilot helmet. Audio-wise, the music's pretty standard. I say this a lot, but it's got some classic military sci-fi themes going on. It works for where it is, but I'm not sure if it's something I'd consider listening to outside of the context of the game. While the game does lack voice acting, some of the sound effects were pretty cool. I particularly liked the mechanical roar sound that happens when you enter sortie, but I think my favorite has to be the noise that goes on when your selected mech spots new enemies in a map. Okay, so let's briefly recap some of the things I spoke about in their respective sections. There's pretty much no story. There's not good indication of estimated damage, which makes it hard to plan turns ahead. Gameplay becomes repetitive. Players who had been sold on the game during its 1.0 release understood it as a more open-world experience, only for a 2.0 release to reformat the map into linearity. Mech customization is maybe lacking or less striking than intended. But were there issues on the technical end? During my initial runs of the game, I did encounter some frame rate hiccups here and there. Though I will say this must have been patched, as my final start-to-finish campaign completing run was bereft of this problem. This was built in the Unity engine, which I know can cause some problems in this regard. If you check the Steam discussion here, there are a few threads detailing how the game quote-unquote runs hot, even on more highly powered graphics cards. I think this is an unfortunate engine issue that happens when Unity is running with certain graphics cards. So that's definitely something to potentially look into before you purchase this one. Also, for some reason, this game seems to crash frequently during startup for me, which is weird. Another issue that I encountered is that I think I soft-locked myself during one of my runs. I ran out of camp supplies, meaning I could no longer rest to restore pilot and mech health. I went to the resupply point, but they too didn't give me more supplies or let me rest. My crew was damaged to the point where doing any of the scenarios open to me would have 100% without a doubt been a loss for my team, so I restarted the game. It does occur to me at this point that maybe I should have faced the loss as potentially something happens that would have put me back into the game instead of just a game over screen. I really wish this game would have kept up with its initial open world mode while adding in the addition of the linear campaign as an option. I feel like an open world mode with more potential modifiers for the player to play with could really potentially add to the replayability of this one. Having the option of a more infinite conquest mode could be really great, especially if it had fine-tuning sandbox options per scenario. I guess while I'm dreaming, maybe a whole scenario editor where you could build your own battle maps and share them with other users. That would be sick. The unique time manipulation gameplay mechanic of Phantom Brigade carries its shortcomings, but you kinda gotta have to really like it. What this game misses out on in terms of story or maybe graphical charm, it gets in return in novelty for this 5-second planning playstyle. I'd recommend this one for fans of tactical strategy games who are looking for a new and unique spin on the genre. Overall, I did end up enjoying my experience and feel like I could play around in this one even more to try out different build setups. However, the flaws in this game were pretty noticeable. Phantom Brigade is kind of like getting a pair of shoes that are kind of boring looking, but super comfortable to wear. Except sometimes the left shoe comes untied when you're walking. The laces coming untied is really annoying when it happens, and you maybe have more fashionable shoes in your closet, but dang, this pair just feels so good when you wear them.